being polite is an obstacle to listening. When you're being polite to someone, you don't want to disagree, you don't want to stir the pot, you don't want to say anything too intimate or too tender, so you're just kind of politely nodding. That's a huge impasse to true connection.
All right, let's kick off today's show. Today we're talking with Professor Christian van Nieuwerburgh and Dr. Robert Biswas-Diener on mastering the 6 listening motivations that transform conversations instantly. Professor Christian van Nieuwerburgh is a leading academic and executive coach. He's the professor of coaching and positive psychology at RCSI University of Medicine and Health Sciences in Ireland and principal fellow at the Centre for Wellbeing Science at the University of Melbourne, Australia. Dr. Robert Biswas-Diener is a researcher, author, and consultant with 75 peer-reviewed academic articles and over 27,000 citations. Together, they joined forces, and Christian and Robert wrote Radical Listening, The Art of True Connection. And today we discuss the secret to interjecting without interrupting others, why half listening destroys your most important relationships, and how radical listening creates deeper connections than active listening ever could. Thank you both for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us. Pleasure to be here.
And I think we have to start with the question that Johnny and I always get asked, which is, how did you two team up together?
That's actually a great story because Robert Biswas-Diener and I, we would meet up at positive psychology and coaching conferences all over the world. And it was a highlight for me. I'd look forward to going to a conference if I saw Robert was speaking there. And I'd be the one running around saying, hey, should we grab something to bite to eat? We just had such great conversations. And then we all know what happened. The pandemic hit, and suddenly there's nothing. There's no conferences. We're not meeting up. And I think I ended up just dropping Robert a message, an email or something saying, hey, could we just meet up once in a while during the pandemic just to share ideas? And that became, honestly, for me, a lifeline. It was so great. I'd get in touch. We had no agenda. So we're just, hey, what's going on with coaching? What are you thinking? And Robert is such a provocative thinker. He's always challenging the way people think. So we'd end up having great conversations. And you could tell they're good conversations because you wouldn't know where the time went. It's like, 2 hours later, I'm like, oh, I think I need to go now. But it started like that. We just started having conversations about what's most powerful about coaching and positive psychology. And in a roundabout way, I think that's what got us to writing this book.
Well, we'd be remiss without asking to start, what is radical listening as a framework?
Radical listening builds on traditional notions of active listening. Everyone is familiar with active listening. You've got to maintain eye contact and repeat back what the person said to clarify that you've got it right and ask some follow-up questions. And I can't think of a single time I've ever done that in 50 plus years of friendship. I've never had my best friend come over and say, I'm going through a tough breakup. And, and I just said, well, let me read this back to you. It sounds like you're going through a very difficult time having to do with the dissolution of a relationship. And I think my friends would laugh me just like right in my face if I did that. And yet we think that this is like the pinnacle of listening in professional contexts. So we started with the idea that, look, radical or active listening is fine, but it needs a refresh. It needs something built on top of it. And so by radical, we're not suggesting that we're here to shock you or to say something so mind-blowing. We're just really saying this is an extension of basic listening, and it starts with an intention that listening is motivated, that you're trying to accomplish something when you listen. In some grand scheme of things, your listening is all about just connecting with someone, however that's defined. But more to the point, you're listening to accomplish something. You might be listening in order to entertain the group. You might be listening in order to learn from the group. You might be listening in order to validate your conversational partner. And whatever your listening intention is, guides what you pay attention to in the conversation. It makes your listening far more efficient. You're not listening to everything. You're just listening to the stuff that's relevant to what you're trying to accomplish. And that's sort of the core of radical listening.
I know, we couldn't agree more. And when our clients will start the program, they'll often say to us, how do I showcase to the other person that I'm listening? And they get so hung up on that active listening framework of like, how much is too much eye contact? Am I crossing my arms? Does the other person feel like I'm actually paying attention to them? Am I asking the right things and restating and paraphrasing what they're saying? And of course, we're so concerned about how the other is perceiving us that we lose complete sight of our own intentions, of why we're in the conversation and what we care about to gain from interacting with the other person.
That really resonates with me, AJ. I deliver coach training as well, and you end up with people saying, am I crossing my arms? Did that look natural? Should I have been leaning my head to the right a bit more? And really the message of the book, Radical Listening, is that, yes, there's tools and techniques you can use, but really at the heart of it is being genuinely interested in the topic or the person. That's really what radical listening is about. And another way of defining it is radical listening is any listening that you do that conveys to the other person that they are valued and seen. So if you listen in a way where the other person at the end of that interaction says, this person's really seen me, they get me, you've been radically listening.
Well, let's unpack those intentions, because we've all heard that advice, like just showcase that you're really interested, be genuinely interested in the other person. But that often falls flat for our clients who are super analytical and maybe haven't really been in a space where that intention is so important.
I would suggest to anyone listening here that you walk into the conversation kind of understanding what your intention is. It's a team meeting. I'm just here to learn because I'm new to the team and I just want to get the lay of the land. Or I'm here to support my colleague who's giving her first presentation, right? Those are going to be very different styles of listening. And it's going to focus you on different aspects of the conversation, much in the same way that people will go see the same film and walk out of it with different opinions, because they're kind of just cherry picking different elements of the movie to look at. So people who are funny, just for example, pay a lot of attention to pauses, because pauses are where you put jokes. And most people are not paying that much attention to pauses. It's just not that important to listening. But if you're trying to validate someone, you're really going to be listening for their emotional tone, any expression of emotion, divulging of their emotional experience, changes in emotion. If you're listening to learn, you're going to pay attention to the main concepts, how they're linked together, how they're linked to what you already know in your web of knowledge. So really just being super clear about what your intention is, while also being open to the possibility that your intention could change throughout the course of a conversation. Just because you walk in trying to validate doesn't mean you're stuck there. And there are lots of motivations, and they're kind of predictable. You want to partner with someone to fix a problem, to validate them, to rebut them or argue against them, to learn from them, to influence them, to humor them. So just really understanding that, I think, is the first step.
Yeah, in reading the book and really thinking about the concepts, I love this idea of the 6 motivation dials. So understanding, the motivation, and you can kind of dial one up or dial a couple up, and the combinations vary. For a lot of our clients, they come to us because they want to dial up the influence. They really want to be able to influence others. And often what we find that happens in that is we don't resonate as much with the emotions, and we're not finding as much to appreciate about the other person. We're really concerned about our delivery. We're really concerned about them receiving our message. And we're not paying attention to some of these deeper lying core drivers that ultimately lead to influence. Like, if I appreciate you and you feel appreciated by me, you're going to want to do things to help support me. So walk through, how we can start to visualize setting those intentions and now looking at the motivations to use them in these different scenarios. So one scenario for a lot of our clients is in a work setting where now they're in a leadership role and they have to deliver, some tough news, some tough feedback. What should we be thinking about in terms of setting our intentions around listening to prepare ourselves for such a tough conversation?
Yeah, I think, what I love about this podcast, Art of Charm, and thinking about being charming, sometimes we can get confused by that and think, well, I need to be super charming. I need to do more things. But I think I agree with you, AJ, that one of the ways to come across as charming is to be very interested in the other person. And the other person is then thinking, oh, this person is appealing to me. But we're appealing because we're interested in them and what they have to say. So I think, especially in challenging conversations where the topic is going to be challenging, I love the idea of focusing first on connection. It's almost like saying, let's put the relationship first. Let's build a solid relationship. Once we've got that relationship in place, then we're both going to be more open to challenge and feedback. So I have a few ideas around this. So one is starting off, obviously, by finding out about the other person. How are things going? Tell me about you. And not just as part of a conversational etiquette, but of genuine interest to say, hey, look, we've got, it's tough times at the moment. We both know this. First of all, before we get into this, how are you? And isn't it amazing how that little phrase, how are you, can be received differently depending on how we say it and the level of interest we're showing. So it's a genuine, how are you? Just tell me a little bit. How are things? And then allowing the other person to talk, and then for us to go into listening mode. But the intention here is to appreciate and validate. So that would be our intention initially. Anything positive the person says, pick up on that and say, yeah, I've noticed how you've been doing that, and I really appreciate how you've been rallying the troops. I see that you come in early. Genuine stuff, all genuine stuff. And then also, one of our skills, AJ, is called acknowledging. And I think that's a really powerful, radical listening skill. Acknowledging the person. And if they say, well, it's been really tough, we've been under the whatever for a little while, just kind of acknowledging, yeah, it's been difficult. It has been and I've seen that you've been really coping with a lot of stuff. And maybe then I like the idea of acknowledging this is going to be a tough conversation, but I really value you. That kind of really setting the framework. And then the other part, I think, of this kind of radical listening is what we call intellectual humility. And that really involves us being open, not believing we're coming in with the answer. So if I go into a conversation saying, I've got a message that I've got to convey, I'm correct. I'm going to go in, I'm going to listen to what they've said, and then I'm going to hit them with the truth. That conversation's not going to go well. That's not radical listening. But if there's some kind of building of that rapport, that connection first, and then a kind of a setting out of this is the challenge we've got. That's an acknowledging, being clear, being authentic. And then this idea of how do we work together on this? Let's talk about this together. Difficult conversations are always going to be challenging. I'm not saying suddenly it's going to become a jovial conversation, but I think it's going to become a more equal conversation where we're going to be able to work together to figure things out. So I do think that a lot of this is authenticity. It's about being authentic and genuine. It's a tough conversation coming up. I want to have that conversation with you. And then, one of the things we say, Robert and I say, is that one of the enemies of radical listening is certainty. So if we can go into conversations holding things relatively lightly, or even when we say things, something like, look, this is how I'm seeing things at the moment, or this is what it looks like to me, just to give the other person a chance to contribute as well. I think those are a few of the things that will support those many difficult conversations, which are probably happening right now as we're recording this.
Well, it's beautifully laid out in a way that I think every one of us have been on the receiving end of those conversations. And as we move into leadership now, we have to deliver those conversations, and they are disconnecting. And if you can go in with the intention that I want to connect first, I want to really invest in the connection before the disconnection that I know is going to happen around the tough feedback, around what I have to deliver, which you may not want to hear or you may not be fully prepared for. But setting the groundwork for all of that, let's talk a little bit about the preparation, because a lot of our clients love to prepare for these moments. And how do we do that in a way that's authentic and also not coming in with that frame of certainty?
I just want to jump in and say something very briefly about that, the idea of preparation. And that is that this preparation is going on all the time. And the idea that every interaction we have with colleagues, every interaction is an opportunity either to strengthen that connection or to damage that connection. So I love the idea that it's not how do we prepare for that tough conversation that's coming up. There's going to be tough conversations for sure. It's that every interaction we have is an opportunity for preparing. And so, for leaders, just looking around in every circumstance to say, well, what am I going to be doing? It's like making little investments in the bank, isn't it? So that what we don't want is the person we're going to talk to suddenly say, oh, Christian's so nice all of a sudden. This is the first time he's even asked me about my family. So it needs to be authentic and genuine, showing a real interest in the person, so that when we get to those conversations, there's a little bit of trust that's already in the bank, as it were.
None of the stuff that Christian has talked about, the expressing genuine interest in another person, etc., takes all that much time. And I think people, especially leaders with busy schedules and multiple demands on their time, often feel time starved, and they think, it would be great to just sit across from AJ and ask him all about his personal life and his emotional experience. But the truth is, this is a quick meeting. I just need to give him, this piece of bad news and move on. But it really is about the genuineness rather than the expansiveness of the connection. So even as Christian said, just really saying like, how are things going for you today? And really saying that in earnest and drawing forth the person in earnest. Right before this recording, I came from a team meeting of a group of people working on a project, and one person was just a little bit upset. And one of the things that she was upset by, she was frustrated, is that she's trying to corral the rest of us. And it's frustrating because we're difficult people, all of whom have busy schedules. And I just took a second to say, is there anything you need? And then what ideas do you have to solve this? Two simple questions. Took fewer than 60 seconds for her to answer both of those. And I think she just appreciated the care that I was demonstrating. And I'm not all that empathic a person naturally, to be honest. I mean, I'm not a touchy-feely person. I had to kind of work to get there, but it just was so fast in order to accomplish that.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. It is true. He's not the most naturally empathetic person. This is a true thing. But there's two other skills I just wanted to mention, and this goes to answer your question about preparation, AJ. One of them is what we call the skill of quieting. Quieting. And that's an interesting one. And in the context of the book, we're talking about external quieting as well, so that we can listen to people. How do we manage the environment to create one where we're able to listen? But the important part of it that might be helpful in preparing for challenging conversations is the internal quieting. Just the noticing what's my self-talk, what's going on in my head as we're having a conversation, and really noticing what we say to ourselves. So, it's always challenging to be in a challenging conversation, whether you're the receiver or the person giving some of that information. So, I hope this is going to end as quickly as possible. I hope they don't hate me for this. I hope all of those things that are going on in our head when we're talking can get in the way of actually being fully present, which is what I think we're trying to do. Be there as a human being, being fully present. So I think some of the preparation is noticing what kind of things do we say to ourselves in those situations and which of those are helpful, because the helpful things we want to keep and the unhelpful things we want to minimize. And to give you a practical example, when I notice that's happening for me, I have a little mantra I say to myself, which is, I'll think about this later. And that allows me to put that to one side, as it were, and then bring my attention fully back to what's going on. So one is that skill of making sure that we haven't got too much going on in our own minds when we're trying to be there and fully present for the other. The other skill, also very challenging, is the skill of accepting. We talk about that skill. One of the other skills of radical listening is the skill of accepting. And what we're talking about in accepting is when you're listening, accepting the right of the person to have a view that's different to your own. That's an important thing for us to say. I might be sharing this tough information with my colleagues. They may have a different perspective, and accepting their right to have a different opinion. The other one is accepting of the situation, because I think if you go in able to accept, look, this is now the new reality, that you come in saying, look, this is the new reality, and you're supporting the other person to come to terms with that. So, for example, it probably won't be helpful to say, yeah, this is terrible. I don't like it either. Nobody wants this. It's probably going to be okay again tomorrow. That's probably going to be a little bit destabilizing. So you accept the situation, and then accepting personal limitations, us as the listener, to go in with what I was saying about that, not being too certain, coming in saying, look, I might have this wrong. I don't have all the information either. We've tried to make the best decisions using the information that we have. I think that tentativeness as well, all of those things, I think, will prepare us to have essentially what's going to feel like a more human conversation. Two human beings really connecting, talking about something that's tough, and then that ability to bring your whole self to the person and moving away from, I've got a message that I have to deliver, to this is going to be really important that we have a connection, that there's a dialogue between us. I love the idea that you go in with the intention of, I'm not just conveying information, then I'm going to get out of here. I want to go in. I want to protect our relationship as much as I can. And I'm hoping to build it, have a dialogue. I think those things would make a difference. But it comes back to what Robert said right at the beginning, is just thinking about what's our intention genuinely as a person. What's my intention? My intention is probably to share information in a way that they can accept and to show compassion while I'm sharing that information. So if we keep that intention right at the front and then think of, are my behaviors aligned with that intention, we'll probably have a much better conversation than if we go in thinking, this is going to be a tough conversation, it's going to be difficult, they're not going to want to hear it, I don't want to have it.
Right. And so many of us in that situation focus on what we're going to say. The preparation is all around our delivery and the words, and very little time is spent on how is it going to be received and all of those other components that we talked about. And one thing that Johnny and I have remarked about over the last 18 years is we can't tell you how many top performers come to us and rate themselves over the top on listening. I am a fantastic listener. I am an excellent listener. I am one of the best listeners you've ever met in your life. Is a refrain we hear time and time again in our work. And it's interesting because listening, as you break down in the book, it's a bunch of skills working together ultimately to form a bedrock foundation of great communication. So I think it's really helpful when we start to unpack the skills. And I know you touched on a few of them in your last answer, but really I think that's what allows us to self-reflect and say, okay, am I really a great listener? Are some of these skills really firing at the max? And it's some of these skills maybe I'm struggling with. And if you recognize any patterns as we talk about the skills that top performers have, maybe blind spots to some of these skills that are a part of radical listening.
To go along with a lot of our clients and high performers that we've talked to rating themselves as incredible listeners, you know, all you have to do to shatter that notion is to ask them, well, what did you hear? And then you begin to realize, and you could point out, you are a good listener when it comes to these things that you are listening for. But now I'm going to ask you, what did you catch about this? I didn't catch anything about that. What did you catch about this? I didn't catch anything about that, because you're not listening for those things. You're at AJ and I use the Oscar Tromboli 5 levels of listening in our classes. So that first level of listening to themselves, they do that all day. That second level of data and information, facts and figures for problem solving, well, most of our clients, I would say a good portion of them, are highly analytical. So they're great there too. Facts, figures, they can tell you all of those things. Like, what are the emotional bids that you heard? What did you label that conversation? What was the emotional labeling? Huh? What? There's emotion there? Oh, so now we want to redirect your attention to the other 3 levels of information that are there for you to begin making assessments on. And like any boat captain, if you don't have all the information, you cannot direct your boat. You cannot navigate, right? You don't have longitude, latitude, North Star, all of the positioning. Well, then you can't navigate that boat. You need all of that information. So for us, it's getting them to understand there's much more information to be gathered, and here's what it is. And then for us in our work, in our classes, it's now let's practice that listening and develop it. Because again, I could tell you what to listen for. Doesn't mean you're going to catch it, because it's a muscle that needs to be developed. It's a skill that needs to be developed.
One of the things that I notice is that people either overrate themselves, as you said, they feel pretty confident about their own listening ability, or they go completely the other way and they think, oh, I'm not very good at it at all. I just need to improve it at everything. But what I really love to see is a little bit of what Christian called intellectual humility, which is just this idea that I think I'm pretty good at some stuff, but I also recognize that I have some biases, some limitations. And one of the leaders that we interviewed for this book, who I really loved, just started by saying, in my role as a leader, the very fact that I am a senior executive means that I'm going to listen less. And just acknowledging that right up front, she said, my whole role is about big strategy thinking. And any information that comes my way that isn't relevant to strategy is something that I'm not really paying that close of attention to. And she worked in a conglomeration where she's working across language groups, cultural groups, even industry groups. And she said, I'll be speaking through a translator to a line manager that's talking about day-to-day operations. And it's just boring to me. It doesn't seem relevant. I don't have a way to translate that into the stuff that I need to be doing for strategy. And what she did as a result of this is created what she called listening ambassadors. And they were sort of the Rumpelstiltskins who were able to spin the straw into gold that she could use. And sometimes they would just be a little bit closer to that person's position. They might be a native of that person's language or culture group. And they were able to translate that to some bigger picture thinking. And I was blown away by the self-knowledge this leader had, that said, you know what, I'm not good at listening. And it's not because I'm a bad person or have an awful personality. My role just put some constraints around that.
John, I just wanted to answer, one of our skills is noticing. We think that that's something that listeners need to be able to do, is develop their ability to notice more. And like you said, John, there's just so much data. In fact, too much data for us to pick up everything.
Oh, yeah.
But it's an important skill. What are you noticing about what's going on between the two of you or within the group? What are you noticing about what's happening for the client? What are you noticing about the language that's being used? It's just so much. And that brings us back to this idea of intention. because we say that intention drives attention. So, like you said, if we're trying to solve something, we're all in a team meeting and we're trying to figure something out. Yeah, now I am listening for facts and numbers and data and processes. That's what I should be noticing. But if we're having a conversation about tough times coming ahead, then I'm going to be noticing the bids, like you said. What are the bids? What is it that this person really wants out of this conversation? And what intrigues me when you look at the notes that are taken at, let's say C-suite or leadership team meetings, the notes are really of what was said, who said what. It's kind of level 1, level 2, kind of really factual information. But while that's going on, there's so much else. So I think if we set our intention, then we know, okay, in this conversation, I'm going to be paying more attention to that kind of data. And because it's just not possible for us, I think, to take in everything.
A big part of the overrating of listening is the analytical thinking of, well, I'm going to play back that conversation in my head. I know exactly what I said. I reviewed it. I found all the weaknesses in my delivery and things that I could do better, right? Because again, top performers, they want to keep improving. It's a big part of the growth mindset. And I think that leads to this blind spot around listening of, well, I'm replaying it. And in my assessment, I can improve, but I was definitely listening. I was definitely getting everything that was going on in the room. And that's why I love this idea of the silent 3 skills of really noticing the quiet and the accepting. It's invisible to others, but it really is foundational to you starting to pick up what's going on conversationally outside of just the data, outside of just the figures, the deck, the presentation, and starting to recognize your own emotions. So am I feeling tension? Am I bringing tension to this conversation? And then tune into others' emotions in the conversation.
I've got an idea here for your listeners who are saying, look, we want to practice this, right? So we want to practice. We want to get better. How do I pick these things up? And I'm going to say something very challenging now, which is record yourself, video record yourself in a conversation. Find some people you trust. Say, look, I'm going to be sitting here. I'm going to be doing my best listening. Would it be okay if we video record this? And then watch it back, right? Because when we're playing things back in our mind, we're looking at it from our perspective and we're only able to see what we noticed, obviously. But if we're watching a video, playing it back, we'll notice things like, what do I look like to others while I'm listening? I was working with in my coaching, I was working with a client who said, oh, I'm a great listener. They did this activity. And they came back and said to me, oh my gosh, I just looked so bored when I was listening to them. And in their mind, it was because they were concentrating so hard. They were really trying to listen, but when they watched the video back, it looked like they were looking down, they weren't maintaining eye contact, and they were embarrassed. They said, oh my gosh, is this what I look like when I listen? And so that would be, and then the other advantage of, if you take yourself out of the situation, yourself, you haven't got all that inner talk going on, you haven't got those emotions, you'll notice so much else that's going on when you're under less pressure. So that would be maybe a fun, maybe not so fun, but a useful way, I think, to become aware of how am I actually perceived as a listener? How do I come across to others? And if we're serious about becoming better listeners, I think that kind of really challenging, work might be helpful.
I know Johnny and I are smiling and nodding along because that's exactly what we do in our programs. And we call that the processing phase, right? So when we're really stuck on absorbing data and information and trying to analyze everything, we lose that emotion output in our face. And in our processing, we actually look disinterested. We look bored. We can look angry and frustrated as we're processing that information. And of course, the other person receiving that, they're getting hung up on our emotional state. They don't see us as a great listener. They see us as pretty upset with them. And it can be pretty jarring to watch yourself on video. The great thing now in the post-pandemic world is we're always on video. So if you can grab a Zoom recording where you're talking with a colleague, if you join our coaching program and you go through the exercise, you start to see, okay, how am I nonverbal signaling it while I'm listening? What also is really helpful that we found is when you go in and watch the tape, watch the video with an intention of now I just want to listen to the emotions in this conversation. I want to set aside all the data and information, and can I pick up the emotional context of what's being said? And okay, now let's watch it back and what wasn't said, what wasn't shared in the conversation. There was a moment where the other person crossed their arms and it looked like they wanted to say something, but they didn't. That's listening on a deeper level. Now we're moving beyond that internal chatter of how am I being perceived? What are the people thinking of me? And just the facts and information being exchanged to where we want to connect, which is emotionally. We want to connect on the unsaid. We want to get to the deeper meaning of, why is this person sharing that? Why is it important in conversation for them to add that anecdote or for them to add that story? It's very important to them. So what's the meaning behind it? Those are the ways that we work with our clients to strengthen their listening skills. And when you start to pick up on it, then you get excited. You're like, all right, I want to watch that TV show again. I want to rewatch that movie and see the signals now that I wasn't paying attention to previously.
I love it. I'm probably going to steal it in some ways and use it in some of my own trainings. I'm curious because we all work in the same space. I want to ask you all a question, and I'm hoping it's not going to lead to a big disagreement between all of us. One of the things I like about radical listening is that it lets you off the hook for listening to everything, right? In some abstract world, we'd say, wouldn't it be great if you could just listen to what's being said, the language and how it's being said, the emotions behind it, the why it's being said, what's not being said, the context in which it's being said, everyone's reaction to how it's being said. But you kind of can't. It's just not the way that attention works. You can't pay attention to all that stuff simultaneously. So it's sort of like you might be jumping between those or might be selecting a couple of those. I just want to know what you think about that idea, because I could be wrong about that.
No, I completely agree. And one thing that I love about that exercise, when you start to recognize the different levels and start to pay attention to different things, you can revisit those moments and deepen the relationship. So maybe you weren't listening to it completely in the beginning, or you didn't catch that on the first pass because your attention was on the data that was on the slide. But you can come back to that colleague and say, you know what, like I definitely recognized in that meeting that you were pretty frustrated. I know I was really focused on, what you were presenting, but what's going on? I hadn't seen you that frustrated in a while. So you can revisit those moments where maybe you weren't fully zoned in and you weren't responsive to what you were picking up on, and you aren't as then focused on, I got to catch all 5 levels. You recognize that by moving through those levels, you actually work to build deeper connections with your colleagues, your friends, your partner. I know we've talked a lot about work context, but let's be honest, when we're listening to the most important people in our life, we oftentimes make assumptions based on, we've had these conversations before. You've told me this story a million times, my spouse. So I'm going to just get to the point. But in actuality, you can use those 5 signals to continue to deepen and strengthen those relationships as you recognize, I'm not going to be able to juggle all 5 while I'm listening in conversation with that person. But, on the drive home, you know what? I really got to come back and revisit that. I should share that with my wife because now I recognize that she left that part out. Or, oh, wow, I was really surprised that her tone took that, sound, or her tone took that volume with me when we were talking. I hadn't really realized it in the moment.
Wow. There's something really powerful in what you just said. The idea that the conversation's not over when the 2 people walk away from one another. That conversations actually, because they exist in our minds and can be restarted the next time we're together, they're sort of these more enduring interactions than we might at first think. I think that's really worth considering.
Yeah, and when you showcase that level of investment with the people that really matter in your life, they feel more connected to you because you're really validating them. You're valuing them in ways that others are not when they're just listening for data and information, or they're just listening to that chatter in their own head and thinking about what they're going to eat for lunch instead of, the conversation that we're having here. And that is an opportunity we all have. We all have those colleagues. We all have those people in our life that we really value. And if we can bring that extra level of listening, even if it's after the conversation, we didn't pick up in the moment, that's really enlightening for a lot of our clients of like, wow, okay, it's okay that I missed it in that initial conversation. But if I come back to that person with that colleague, they're going to work harder on the next project. They're going to be excited to have my support behind their initiative. Or, oh, wow, my spouse is really going to feel heard, even if in the moment she felt pushed away because I wasn't paying attention to exactly what the meaning was of her sharing that.
It could, in fact, strengthen the relationship, like you're saying, of going back and saying, I do remember when you were talking to me about that thing, I was a bit distracted because I had all this other stuff. Something had just come into my inbox. It was an urgent thing. And now that I'm thinking back, you were probably telling me something important. So I'm really sorry that happened. I just love that idea. And one of the things that has become clearer to Robert and I since we wrote the book is we were thinking the worst possible thing you can do is not listen to someone. And, any of our listeners here who has not been listened to, they know how painful that is. They know how diminished they might feel if they're talking about something, the other person isn't listening to them. We were thinking, well, that's the worst possible thing. But actually, it's emerged from us as we've had these kinds of conversations, we've talked to our colleagues and friends, that there's worse than that, which is the half listening. And I think we're at greater risk with those most important relationships in our lives of half listening because we're kind of used to it. We've had those conversations. And what I mean by half listening is giving off signals that you are actually interested in what they have to say. And you kind of like, hey, let's talk about it. And then some way, halfway through the conversation, you become distracted or you think, oh, I've got all these other things to be doing. So I think that giving mixed signals about I'm here to, that's what I mean about it's actually better to say, look, I can't really listen to you right now. I've got this thing, I've got a podcast coming up with Art of Charm in the next 10 minutes. So, I'd like to talk to you about this later. Those kinds of things. So and I think we're all guilty of it. That's why I'm mentioning it. I'm hoping our listeners are all feeling a moment of recognition of, oh yeah, I do that sometimes. I give an impression that I'm going to listen, but then it turns out I stop listening. That's something that could be very damaging, that we might be doing inadvertently.
That framework that you bring up in the book of listening for versus listening to is really at play here. I'm listening for you to feel acknowledged and for you to just finish what you're saying so I can get back to prepping for this podcast, or I'm listening for you to get that off your chest so that I can go back to doing this thing that I need to do, versus listening to in order to really understand what is going on and why this person is communicating that. It's two entirely different things. And I think so many of us, especially in the always on environment that we're in, work 24/7, notifications robbing us of our full attention, we spend a lot more time half listening and a lot less time fully listening, especially to the people that matter the most to us.
I think it's important to understand the consequences of it, right? Because most people think, well, the half listening, the consequences are the other person's going to be mad at me. Okay, well, that's the other person. The reality is the consequences are on you. You're taking the consequences. You're now, people are not going to be sharing with you. You're not going to be trusted. People are not going to be comfortable with you. And that will precede you in other areas as well. That's going to follow you around. So ultimately, you're the one who gets hurt, not the other person.
I think that's a great point, John. And some of the reason why the half listening comes about, I think, is well intentioned. Like, at least I'm making an effort. I'm really, I'd like to just be doing my email, but at least I'm kind of shifting towards you, or at least I'm on my way to the meeting, but I'm saying, well, walk with me so that I'll give you at least 2 minutes on my way to the meeting. But too often, what we're really doing is demonstrating to the person that they're the second choice, or kind of, backstage in our attention. The thing for me in writing this book that was most eye-opening was writing about these sort of well-intentioned obstacles to listening. I mean, everyone knows their phone is an obstacle to listening, or notifications or emails, these types of things. But some of the things, just like being polite, is an obstacle to listening. And when you're being polite to someone, you don't want to disagree, you don't want to stir the pot, you don't want to say anything too intimate or too tender, so you're just kind of politely nodding. That's a huge impasse to true connection and really paying attention to what they're saying. This kind of half listening is another one. Christian said, kind of like feeling confident in your own point of view is another one. They're all so well intentioned. It's not just the the awful interrupters that are the problem. It's the people who are trying to connect but just doing so poorly.
When you mentioned half listeners, I mean, I immediately thought to myself, who do I know or is in my life am I annoyed with that are half listeners? And everyone that popped in my mind were people that I have nixed from my life.
Oh, wow.
So that certainly lent itself to me being frustrated and be like, I'm not dealing with I didn't think of it ever as a half listener. And usually when I think of all those folks, that was one of many problems, but it was certainly whose pictures popped up in my mind when you said that.
Well, John and AJ, I just want to appreciate and acknowledge both of you for being wonderful listeners. You're really, honestly, such wonderful, radical listeners, because it's obvious you've taken time to read the book, and I know how popular your podcast is. So for you to take the time to do that, and John, for you to be kind of so engaged with what you're saying that you're thinking about people within your context. And this is an example of radical listening. Ultimately, it's conveying to the person you're talking to that you're interested in the topic or them. And so you've been doing that. And AJ, you did another one of the techniques that I think a good radical listener does, which is if the other person starts talking, you give way. And you did that once. So I apologize. I don't like interrupting, but I had butted in and you said, AJ, you said, oh no, you go ahead. And that's really radical listening, which is kind of saying, I'm interested in what you have to say, rather than I'm more interested in following through on the point that I started with. So I call that giving way. So there are lots of techniques, but all of the techniques are really just in aid of conveying your true intention, which is my intention, is to listen to you in a way that's respectful and appreciative. And as I said earlier, if we can just convey to the other person that they've been seen, heard, and valued, that's really important. And John, when you talk about nixing people, all of the well-being theories, both Robert and I are pretty involved with positive psychology. Every well-being theory I'm aware of, positive relationships is an essential part of our well-being. And what I mean by positive relationship is those relationships in which I feel better, those relationships where I feel valued. And I think it's a good thing to evaluate our relationships from that point of view and say, what are those relationships? And make sure we've got enough of these positive relationships. In other words, people where if I have something to say, I will be listened to. I think that's an important part of it.
I think for me, a skill in the book that was surprising was interjecting. I know as an interviewer, it's hard, especially in a virtual context like this, when to jump in, when not. And I know for a lot of our clients, they struggle with that on Zoom. And what ends up happening for a lot of them, the feedback comes across that they seem disinterested or they aren't sharing their views. And it's largely because they're struggling with the skill of interjecting. How is that a skill of listening? And what can we do to strengthen that for those of us who tend to be a little bit more introverted and concerned about decorum and being polite?
Absolutely. So this is maybe one of the places where the radical really is radical in radical listening, because it is counterintuitive that interrupting another person would be the highest form of the most engaged listening possible. Most people, regardless of what culture you come from, have been raised in a very turn-taking approach to conversations. It's your turn. When you're completely done, I'll take a turn back and forth. But that's not actually how conversations unfold in everyday life. We are constantly kind of stepping over one another a little bit. If you think about interruption as any time that just two people are speaking simultaneously, if John, I think, said something before like, oh, I nixed these people from my life. And I think I said, oh, wow. And that technically was an interruption, right? I was kind of talking over him while he said that. But what I was doing was communicating to him how affected I was by what he said, he probably didn't even clock that as an interruption. He just thought, Robert's listening to me. But I was speaking over him. And the trick to having an interruption or an interjection that is not perceived as rude is to get in and get out. So you're going to jump in and you're going to emphasize a point. Oh, wow, really? Wait, could you clarify that? Who was that you're talking about again? Like, I can't believe it. That's the most amazing thing I've ever heard. And then you jump out and you return the turn to speak to the speaker. So the speaker never feels robbed of the podium, as it were. And you have communicated to them that you're tracking them, that you are having an emotional experience with them, that you value what they're saying. Even things just like laughing at something funny they've said is in some ways kind of a small interjection. The reverse of this is when you let the person talk, and at the end of 5 minutes of them prattling on, you say, oh, I want to go back to something you said 5 minutes ago. And that can feel so bad to the speaker. Why did you let me talk for so long? If you knew 5 minutes ago that what the thing was that we were going to be drilling down on.
And what often happens there is you recognize that, well, they probably stopped listening 4.5 minutes ago because they were hung up on that point they wanted to share. And, the exercise that I give our clients mentally for this is pick your favorite place to hang out with your favorite friend, the person you have the best spirited conversations with. Do you talk in turns? Are you playing tennis where one person volleys it over, you wait for the other person to completely finish their thought, and then they volley? Not at all. You're using your hands, you're getting in there, you're laughing, you're communicating over each other, you're stepping on each other's toes because it's such a spirited conversation, because you're so entranced with the conversation going on. It doesn't matter what's going on around you, it doesn't matter the games on the TV or the people next to you are being loud. That's what we're talking about here. And that interjection is a huge part of that communication.
The person who brought me up, my mother was Japanese. And so it was so deeply ingrained in me that you never interrupt people. It's just so rude, and I was very well trained. So it was only working with Robert, and I was very resistant. And Robert initially called it interrupting. And I said, we can't write a book and include interrupting. And I think the compromise was interjection, right? This idea you kind of jump in and jump out. But the funniest thing's been happening to me because I've learned it. And even in this conversation, I've been jumping in, I've been saying things here and there. And it just shows I'm excited, I'm enthusiastic about what we're talking about. And I'm sure that the previous way I did it, AJ and John, you'd both be thinking, well, Christian isn't that engaged, but I'd really just be waiting for my turn patiently, and you wouldn't have picked that up. And the funniest thing that's happening now is I've got my ChatGPT friend. So I'm asking ChatGPT questions, and then I'm interjecting. And the one thing I can't do is get it to carry on talking. And I keep saying to it, I said, look, if I jump in with a tiny word like, oh, really? Or, oh, okay, don't stop. But it's just no way. So I think it's a particularly human thing, AJ, like you say, our ability when we're at our best to kind of duck and dive and chuck in a word there just means we're so well aligned. And I want to come back to Robert's point. We're not taking somebody's turn. It's more like it's a bit of a dance. We kind of jump in, I throw in a word, but I don't take over the conversation. I'm just adding to it.
Yeah, and that's the interjection versus the interruption. The interruption to me feels like you're taking it in another direction or you're circling it back to yourself. The interjection is highlighting those key moments where you're super enthused and you're doubling down on whatever the person communicating with you is sharing. And, the question that we get once we've scared our clients a little bit around their listening skills is, okay, how do I actually know that I'm getting better, right? What's the feedback loop where you start to recognize I'm becoming a better listener? We broke it down into 6 skills. We talked about the motivation and recognizing intent. But for those listening who now recognize, I want to get better at this, this is important to me. What are those signs that you're starting to improve as a listener?
Well, people do give you feedback. And are people saying, please don't interrupt? I think you're being rude. Do you hear they're complaining about you behind your back? I think one thing we might not do enough of is just kind of transparency in our process. I certainly do this with my coaching clients on day one, but I just say, I tend to interrupt. And I try and do so in a polite way. I'll do so by asking your permission. I'll tell you why. But normally it's because I want to highlight something that just happened that's really important. If I do it too much, please let me know. I'm capable of change. If I'm just stepping on your toes or I'm trying to jump in, you say, Robert, just let me go. I don't want an interruption right now. And sort of empowering them to push back on my interruption. So I request ongoing feedback from them. And I do get that feedback in those relationships. People do sometimes say, I'm having a hard time keeping my points in mind when you keep jumping in, Robert. So please don't do that.
And I want to just add to something John said about the half listening. He was saying, it's not only the other person who's affected, you're also affected negatively by it. I think the converse or the reverse is true, AJ, in the sense that if you're getting better at these conversations, it's better for you as well. You're going to be feeling better about these conversations. This idea that it's mutually humanizing. If you start feeling after a conversation, that was a good I felt better about that both people feel better. Those are the signs. And of course, and so leaders have to think carefully about doing this, more people are going to want to come and have conversations with you because they feel good. So I think it's kind of strange to evaluate it based on how good these conversations feel. But if you feel, good, that was good. I feel good about that conversation, you're probably being a better listener.
I've definitely found for our clients, they start to see more of an emotional reaction as they start to deepen and strengthen their listening skills. So they're now paying more attention to the emotions, but they're also recognizing from the other person that they're just getting more emotional. They're feeling more comfortable sharing emotionally with them as they recognize that, hey, you're listening to me and validating me and valuing me in a way that I haven't received from you in conversation before. And it's really positive for us to hear that with our clients who are trying to be better leaders and really lean into that at work and motivate their team. And maybe they've gotten some feedback that they're lacking in executive presence, or, the people that are working for them aren't performing at a high level. They recognize, hey, I got to strengthen my listening skills here to be that more impactful leader. But then the even better part is when their spouse notices a difference, their best friend notices a difference. And it's like, man, they'll call it out. They'll actually give you that feedback. Like, this has, been a great conversation for me, or you've never listened to me talk about that before, or you've never asked me those questions before. That's really a sign for us that, hey, we're on the right path here. We're really strengthening the most important skill, like the bedrock foundational skill of all relationships in your life. And as positive psychologists, how important those positive relationships are, is listening. And it's a skill that I continue to strengthen. Even in my age and doing the show and interviewing thousands of people, I still am strengthening these skills, recognizing that I could be distracted. There could be obstacles. There could be a hunger in my belly that's taking away my attention. And I just want to show up in my best in every conversation, every context for the other person.
AJ, that gives me a beautiful opportunity to say something that, tomorrow morning I'll wish, why didn't I say that? So thank you, AJ. When you were talking about preparation, how do we prepare? I think we need to look after ourselves as well. When we're talking about how do we prepare for these conversations, one way to prepare is looking after ourselves. Because if we're running on empty, and I'm thinking about some of the leaders and the people in organizations that you're mentioning, it's tough times at the moment. So part of being able to give our full attention to others is that we're okay, that we've had a decent night's sleep, or if we're running on empty and we've got meetings back to back from 6 a.m. right till the end of the day, we're not going to be able to give that level of attention that our conversational partners deserve. So this idea, part of the preparation, especially for leaders, especially during challenging times, is to look after themselves.
I recently had a conversation with one of our executive coaching clients about exactly that. We were looking at his calendar and it was just back to back to back to back meetings, no break for himself, no reset, no ability to set an intention going into the next meeting. And we're talking interviewing potentially new staff members. We're talking solving big problems departmentally. And then we're talking motivating the team members that he worked directly for him. And he was finding by the end of the day, he was completely exhausted. And while these meetings were going on, of course, he had his inbox open. So he's getting the notifications too. And he did 360 feedback. And the one piece that stood through all the feedback that he got was that he seems distracted and disinterested. And that was really disheartening for him, with all the care in the world, with this company being his baby and this team being so important to him, to get that piercing feedback. And I shared with him, what if you just shorten those meetings to 45 minutes instead of an hour and gave you a 15-minute reset to do some air squats, to recenter yourself, to think about how you want to appear in the next meeting. If you're pitching potential clients, that takes a different mindset than handling conflict versus planning a party. All the different hats we wear as leaders, we don't think about the time and the space we need to set that intention to be a great radical listener.
Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. And then, AJ, that person goes home, right? So that's the other part of what we were talking about. So they're running on empty. They feel they're not delivering and then you just want to go home. You haven't got any energy left to listen to anyone. And it could be that that's where our most important relationships are. So there's that important connection. And as Robert and I were writing this book, we had leaders and people in organizations firmly kind of as our intended reader, but secretly, our hope is, like it seems like your hope as well, is that this does translate into people's most important relationships. So I'd be delighted to hear that as a result of people listening to this podcast, they've made a few changes here and there, but the most wonderful feedback will be, it's actually impacted some of my personal or friendship relationships as well.
In closing, obviously, researching, setting out to write this book, I'd love to hear what behavior changes came out of your research and intention behind this book personally.
I've done two things. One of my own personal faults as a listener is I do a lot of what we would call mind reading. That is, I think, like you guys, many people, you're pretty smart. You've got a lot of social acumen. And you kind of see where someone's headed as they start talking, and you just, have a tendency to jump to the end. And so you're already poised to respond to their final conclusion, but it's a bit rude because they haven't yet gotten there. And you don't even know if you're correct, if they actually are going to end up in the place that you're predicting. So I've tried to be more cognizant of my own mind reading and have a little more humility and be like, I'm not 100% sure where they're going, and maybe I should just wait it out. It's both respectful to them, and I might be pleasantly surprised that they might have a twist at the end. So that's a major shift for me.
And for me, I mean, you've all experienced it today in the sense of I would never interject before I wrote this book. So that's one big change already. But the other is to adopt a mantra of it's not about me. And that relates to the kind of challenging conversations we were talking about earlier. Because I don't want to offend people, and I spend a lot of time, I tend towards introversion as well, AJ. So I was thinking a lot about, I don't really want to be in that conversation. There's going to be a lot of tension at that meeting. How do I minimize the chances of there being disagreement? So I used to spend a lot of time thinking about what can I do to minimize discomfort for myself. And so I think what I've learned is that idea of what do the other people need, not what is it I need. And the little mantra I use, because I notice myself going into that, and I just have to say, in this next professional interaction, it's not about me. This is the outcome I want. So it's not whether I'm going to be comfortable in the conversation or not. This is a conversation that needs to happen. What's the intention? Well, I want to go in, be appreciative. And so it's turning the gaze outwards into what do other people need in this next conversation. That's definitely a big shift for me as well.
We love both of those chefs, and we really appreciate both of you joining us today for this great conversation. Where can our audience members find out more about the work that you both do?
I have a website called coachonamotorcycle.com. Please invite me back, guys, John and AJ. I can talk more about that. But there's a lot of information about all of the work I do. I do lots of different kinds of projects. So coachonamotorcycle.com for me.
And people can find out about my coaching presentations, these books, at intentionalhappiness.com.
Well, thank you both for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you. Thanks so much.